Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self-Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. Talking about sex in a self-led way can be darn difficult, whether that is with partners, clients, or professional helpers. Today's guest is an expert on courageous sexual communication. She has helped sex offenders, sexual abuse survivors, folks with compulsive sexual behaviors, as well as couples facing the everyday challenges of life to have brave and healing conversations. Nancy Wonder is a licensed psychologist and certified IFS therapist who lives in Tallahassee, Florida, where she conducts individual and couple therapy. She serves as a senior trainer for Intimacy from the Inside Out and is a past co-lead trainer for the IFS Institute. Nancy has been involved in over 20 trainings and has presented at the annual IFS conference on various topics, especially on IFS and IFIO applied to sexual issues and treatment. She contributed a chapter to the book Internal Family Systems Therapy New Dimensions, entitled Treating Pornography Addiction with IFS, as well as a chapter in the book Internal Family Systems Therapy Supervision and Consultation, entitled Making the Unconscious Conscious in IFS Consultation of Sexual Abuse, Sexual Offending, and Sexual Compulsivity. It was such a pleasure to talk with Nancy Wonder, who feels a similar passion to my own for bringing sexuality out of exile for individual and collective healing. So, Nancy, I am so honored that you are here as a guest on the Self-Led in Bed podcast. You may not be aware of this, but you've been a presence in my IFS journey before we even met in person. I
Oh,
have read, well, actually, your books might have come out, your first book chapter may have come out shortly after I got into the IFS community. But I think it was the first IFS conference I went to. I attended a workshop that you did with Larry Rosenberg. And then I did the IFIO training shortly after I had done my level one, and you were on the team there and an inspiration. And you've done so many interesting things related to IFS and sexuality since then. So I'm really psyched that you're here and to see where
mm,
this conversation goes.
thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Mhm. Yeah. So before we jump in, I'm wondering if you want to check and see what parts are here for you as we get started.
I appreciate that. I have a part that's a little nervous. I may say something stupid, but not too much because I like talking to you. So I'm sure it'll be fine. But I do have a little performance anxiety. And I also have a part that loves that you're doing this podcast because people want to talk about sex, and I think it's great we're going to talk about it.
Yay.
Yay. So I'm excited.
Yeah,
I'm
cool.
excited and a little nervous.
Yeah, well, welcome. Welcome to your
Yeah.
nervous part and to your excited part. And it's always good for me to check in too, because I think I always have a bit of a nervous part at the beginning as well. And
Sure.
it always eases back, but just at the beginning, these parts that want this to be just so well done, and
Of
so
course. Of course.
yeah, and want to maximize the opportunity to talk with you. So
So we'll just feel into that. And I admire
yeah.
your work too.
Mm,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Mutual Admiration Society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there anything else you'd like to share about who you are or some of your social identities for
Sure.
listeners who may not be familiar with you?
Yeah. So Nancy Wonder, I live in Tallahassee, Florida. I am cisgender. I like being a girl. That I always have been, and I'm heterosexual. I'm in my second marriage. This one's long term and really good and solid. And I'm a grandmother, and I have three grandchildren and one daughter. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and that's really important to me.
Mm.
Yeah. And what else? I like to, I'm very interested in sexuality as a field. I think it's so important and think it can be a real contribution because people are afraid to talk about it.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a part of my identity, I think, is bringing sexual issues in the forefront.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, Nancy, if you're comfortable to share, do you have a sense of, for you, what speaks to you about that? What drew you?
Sexuality.
Yeah, what's drawn you to really value sexuality?
Yeah. Well, one
And
part is in my background, and I'll talk about that more later, but but I started working with sexual offenders. After I got my PhD in psychology, I worked as a resident in a prison, and part of my job, my psychology residency was in a prison. I was a senior psychologist, and part of my job was evaluating and treating sex offenders, people, men. It was a men's prison who had a criminal offense for a variety of sex offenses. And so I ended up really liking that population for some reason, and I felt drawn to it. So I started on that side of sexuality, and that led me to work with sexual abuse victims. And I found a lot of meaning in that. And some of it's because of my personal history, but also it's such an important social problem. It's huge. And it gave me a lot of meaning. Then that led me to more healthy sexuality and and as I became a couple therapist, as my career went further, I realized how it's so hard for couples to talk about sex and how could I help in that arena with some people in couples having a sexual abuse history.
Mhm.
Or I also have worked with couples with one of the members of the couple is sexually acted out or is maybe looking at porn a lot. So that's the kind of stuff I've treated, and I just found a lot of meaning in it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm just fascinated by that trajectory and starting in the prison and with offenders, and like you said, that dark side, and then how much you liked it and how fulfilling it was for you, and how that then had, led into these other,
Yeah, it was
phases and
weird.
stages.
It was weird because I know people would say, "How can you stand to treat sex offenders?" But there was something compelling about it. And many of them had trauma. All of them, I can say, have had trauma. And I
Mhm.
think Dick Schwartz would agree with me that the sexual offending doesn't come out of anywhere. It's based on trauma, not necessarily sexual abuse, but some kind of incredible trauma, so that the sexuality became a coping mechanism, or we might call a firefighter, a place to distract and cope. And so I think some of it was unconscious, my own parts, my own childhood, wanting to treat sex offenders, wanting to
Mhm.
be redeemed in my own way.
Mhm. Yeah. And when did you encounter IFS? I think you
That is,
said
yeah,
earlier on you weren't using IFS at that point, correct?
that's right, right. Because I graduated with my PhD in 1997. It was kind of a midlife career change. I became a psychologist. And then in 2002, maybe, I went to a yoga retreat, and one of the yogis had a flyer. She was inviting Dick Schwartz to the Atlanta area. I live in Tallahassee, so I'm just 4 hours south of there. And so I went to see him. I don't know. She said, "You might like this." And who knows why I went. And he did a 2-day intro in this little college west of Atlanta. And I loved it and loved what he was doing. And I started doing personal work then on the telephone because there was nobody in Tallahassee doing IFS. And that
Mhm.
led me to do level one. And then I became a program assistant. And I just really loved IFS. It really suited me as far as the way I like to work on my part. Myself, I'm very much like to go inside and real imaginal kind of person. And so it just really suited me. And then that led to eventually doing IFIO with Tony Hermy Blank. And when was that? 2008 or 9 when she developed that model from
Mhm.
IFS.
I'm
And
just thinking some people listening might not be familiar with IFIO. Can you just say what that stands for and just like a
sure,
quick capsule of what it
no
is?
problem. Yeah, intimacy from the inside out, which is IFS applied to couples. It's very much an IFS model. And it was developed by Tony Herby Blank, who uh, loved IFS, but had a history of being an imago couple therapist. So she kind of combined the two and developed some protocols to use using IFS with couples. And that's I train with her now. I'm a senior trainer with IFIO. And it's led me to more couple work with sexuality.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that was when I did my first level of IFIO was in New York City.
Yeah, I remember
And
it so well. Yeah.
yeah, it was, I remember sitting in the circle in that group and just feeling like I am exactly where I am meant to be at this moment in time. It
Oh,
was
that's
just such a
great.
great and exciting fit. And um, yeah, so gosh, there's so many top juicy things we could jump into here. Well, maybe then,
So many
okay,
roads.
so you got to the couples work, and then how have you developed your work with sexuality within that? Like, do you have people coming to you specifically to work with their sexuality, or, did you see a gap in the training people had in working with couples related to sexuality?
Yes, both of those things. At first I got a lot of couples where it was usually the man, every single couple, not to be stereotypical, but every heterosexual couple. I got a lot of referrals for the man was looking at porn all the time, and it was impacting his relationship with a woman and his life, really, his functioning. So, we used to call that sexual addiction. Now we might call it out of control pornography use. And so that's sort of how it began. Couples would come to me for that. And the betrayal of the female and the shame and et cetera that the man would feel for his use of pornography. So it started there, and then but then it became obvious that even couples that didn't have that issue were having trouble talking about sex. So then I got more interested in, hey, let's talk about sex. So even if you didn't come to me for that reason, how is sexuality impacting your relationship? And from there, I realized how little education therapists get to talk about sexuality with couples. And I hooked up with Larry Rosenberg. He was an early trainer in IFIO, and he and I connected on the sexuality theme. So we started doing workshops at the IFS conference, and we still do an advanced IFIO training together. But just, hey, let's talk about sex. It's such a repressed topic.
Mhm,
And most couples entering your office are probably dealing with some kind of sexual issues.
mhm.
And so, I think that's answering your question, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. I
absolutely.
kind of got lost what I was talking
Yeah, great.
about. Okay,
Yeah. So kind of your specialization, you started to attract clients
go. Right.
who were concerned with use of pornography that was bringing up parts for them and
And
for the
their partner.
couples, and then working in the IFIO community, seeing that there were real gaps in the training. And I have
Exactly.
parts, as you're saying that's such a soapbox for some of my parts. Like, how can we say that we're addressing connection and intimacy and whether it's with individuals or couples that want to feel more connection in their relationships, more aliveness in themselves, and yet we exile this really fundamental part of life. So my parts are
Exactly.
cheering that you
Yeah,
also
you and I are on the
have
same
those
bandwagon.
feelings.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Let's talk about it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you help couples get more comfortable talking about sex or having courageous conversations, which I think is the language IFIO uses quite a
That's right. Courageous communication is specifically what it's
Mhm,
called. Yeah.
mhm,
We talk about sex just like we do anything else. In IFIO, we have a tracking protocol, which many couple theories do, where you track back and forth horizontally. So instead of talking about the dishes, who didn't take the trash out and how the other person's mad, we talk about sexuality.
mhm,
So just openly talk what happens when you get in bed. And then we start tracking the protectors.
mhm,
We have protective parts and we have exiles. So just like with any topic in couples, sexuality involves our protectors and our exiles. So I would begin tracking. For example, I just recently had a couple who are not really sexually active, but they sleep in the same bed every night. So we started talking about what parts of you come when you lie down in bed, what part comes up for you and what part comes up for you. And then, you start tracking the protective dance and what keeps the protectors that are keeping them away from each other physically
mhm,
and
mhm,
keeping them protected from opening up sexually and intimately.
mhm.
Intimately. Yeah. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And do you find that couples can relate to that? Like they can recognize that there's parts of themselves that are on guard or vigilant in
Yeah, they
some
really
way?
can. Yeah, they really can. Sometimes I think it's helpful to do tracking, protective sequences and other topics first,
Mhm,
because like therapists, we don't talk about sex, neither do our couples. So a lot of times I'm starting with other kind of protective cycles first,
mhm,
like fights about the children, fights about the who takes the trash out, fights about money. And then once they get used to the idea of I have a protective part, they do the U-turn, as Dick talks about. Couples help them do the U-turn with their own parts. They're able to unblend a little bit and give some recognition. They have the cycle with their partner. Then we can bring sex to the couple,
mhm,
to the
mhm.
table.
Yeah.
And they've trusted me by now. There's a lot of rapport.
Mhm,
There's a lot of unblending going on, and I think for most couples, it helps to have some other things, other conflicts sort of sorted before we go to sexuality.
mhm.
That makes
Yeah, that does. It makes a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah,
And a question I get a lot from therapists is how, if I'm not used to bringing this up, how do I bring it up? And in my position, and maybe similar for you, I'm out there in the world as a sex therapist. So typically people already have some agenda related to sexuality when they come to see me, or they at least anticipate that that might be on the map.
yeah.
Um,
It makes it easier when you're advertised as a sex
mhm.
therapist. But
Right, exactly. So when you're working with couples or training therapists who work with couples who are coming in for a more maybe not specifically sexual concern, I wonder if you could say something about how you invite it in with your couples, how do you introduce it, or how do you advise other people to do that, other
right,
therapists?
that's a great question. I tend to just bring it up. As we start talking about contracting at the beginning, which may be more than one session, you start contracting about what do you really want to do here? What's happening with the relationship? Where are your areas of conflict? I try to say, and what about sex? Is that something you'd like me to help you with? And they usually say yes. So
Mhm,
I just bring it up.
mhm.
And then
Yeah.
maybe they don't want to explore it right then, but we've
Mhm,
got it we've bookmarked it as a goal.
mhm.
So then
That's great.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll check back with it later.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that gets at the question of your own comfort level, right? That you're
Exactly.
someone who prioritizes this as an important subject and you've done a lot of work in this area. You can bring it up comfortably.
Yes,
And
I can, but I get
yeah,
many therapists can't.
yeah.
And that's when Larry and I do our advanced training for IFIO. We spend the first day having people do the U-turn in themselves and finding their parts that are not comfortable talking about
Hmm.
sex.
Hmm.
So I think that's a huge thing for people to work with.
Hmm.
And we know the sexual abuse numbers are very high, right? Maybe 1 out of 3 or 4 women, maybe 1 out of 5 to 7 boys have been sexually abused by 18. So I think with therapists, we also have had sexual
Hmm.
hurts.
Hmm.
So that's another reason why we don't bring it up. So
Right.
really addressing the sexual hurts within the therapist in their own therapy so that they
Hmm.
can be comfortable talking about it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I've read as well that those numbers might even be higher in the therapist population.
Yeah, have you read that? Because I was wanting to find some research on that. It just really seems like it is.
Right. Like who would be attracted to helping people with trauma is often people who have trauma. So there's a or
Exactly.
have recovered from trauma or are coping with the impact of trauma.
Yeah, the
So
wounded
so
healer.
there's yeah, a higher preponderance. And again,
Yeah,
I'm so on the same page with all of this. And the the bliss groups that I'm running came from that motivation that there weren't a lot of spaces for helping professionals, for therapists to turn toward their own sexual system and get to know what's there. And
yeah, that's so
so,
important. I love that you're doing that. I really do.
yeah.
I just did a workshop in the Netherlands, which is a combination of IFS sexuality, and then I also did an intro on IFIO. And I sent a welcome letter to them, the Dutch, this group of Dutch people, naming sexual abuse statistics and saying, I want, just to let people know that things might get triggered. And I think that that helped with the safety to the point that people really dropped into a lot of vulnerability
Wow.
the first couple of days of
Mm,
the
yeah.
workshop. And I think I think client or therapists are hungry
Mm,
to talk about it and
right.
to be able to hold the pain around any kind of sexual abuse
Mm,
or exploitation or even just
mhm,
subtle
mhm.
sexual harassment, those kinds of
Right.
things. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
And I also find that um, the general cultural burdens. There's so many collective legacy burdens around sexuality that we as human beings, whether we're therapists or on the client side or just someone who is wanting to grow, as a person, we absorb this stuff and we often haven't had a lot of chances to step back and really reflect on it or be able to heal it with these powerful approaches like IFS and
Yeah.
IFIO.
Yeah. What do you call it? Vicarious trauma? Listening to the
Vicarious
story.
trauma and
Yeah.
even um, you know, the inhibitions, even when there's not been specific trauma, just sort of these inhibitions that come in. And I want to name, of course, that there's many kinds of people and some fit into the mainstream culture and are validated for their gender and their sexual orientation and their body type and race and all
Exactly.
the things. So
Right.
so that like we have the intersectionality aspect of this, that the burdens we carry both come from our own lived experience,
That's right.
personally, and then
Mhm.
are compounded by what we've experienced based on these different social identities and stigmas.
Exactly. And that is, like you say, a legacy.
Mhm.
What have you inherited? For
Right.
example, there was sexual abuse in my family before I was even born. So
Hmm.
it's a legacy burden
Hmm.
that we carry.
Right.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. So I wonder if there's um, I was going to say like a story, or I was looking over before we met some of your writing. And if you haven't had, I'll tell listeners, if you haven't had a chance to read any of Nancy's chapters, you're a wonderful writer and always
Oh,
use
thank you.
story case, examples and stories that are very engaging. So you talked about in the New Dimensions book, it's called Internal Family Systems, New Dimensions. You talk about someone who you call Herb, who compulsively masturbates, and he's shares with you a whole deep story, of his parts and how they came to that. And I guess I'm thinking maybe would you want to share some sort of story or example of kind of what sorts of exiles maybe people have, or I guess
Sure,
mapping a system a bit where there's some maybe compulsive sexual behavior as an
sure.
example.
Yeah, he's a good example. And then I have others, but they, in his case, his mother was very, very, well, she was bipolar. So I mean, I think bipolar one, really bipolar, not just called that and had other things. 'Cause she would disappear into the bedroom because she'd go into a major depression. So as a child, and when she was up and around, she had a lot of anxiety, and especially around anything to do with body, right? So she was repressed sexually, that one might say, one might guess. And so he started finding magazines. And he was older, so we're talking Parade magazines. I don't know if you
Mhm.
remember that, but
Yes,
that was
I do.
you know,
Pre-internet.
yeah, in the Sunday
Yeah.
for the younger set that's listening to this, Parade magazine would be in the Sunday paper, and they would have swimming suits, models with swimming suits and stuff like that. So he would look at those. He found magazines his dad had stashed in the closet behind a false wall. And so with his trauma, he identified his part as Peter Pain, the part that was lonely and had a combination of loneliness and anxiety, very painful because he had been basically neglected by his mother. And the father was just never there, kind of an absent father. And so when he reached puberty, he found a lot of solace, a lot of comfort in pictures of naked women. Well, actually, the image he liked was sort of the Marilyn Monroe on the vent with the skirt up and the underpants, and he loved that. So we got to know that part of him that was attracted to women in their underwear, and then the part of him that hated that part of him. So it's just like I'm sure many of your listeners know C. Sykes, who talks about the addiction polarity between, if you want to call it addiction, but the firefighter manager polarity, where the critic is so shaming of the part that acts out. So
Mhm.
a lot of times with guys like Herb, we start with the critics that hate the one that acts out sexually, that's spending so much time on porn. And we start with that critical manager. And there's usually more than one. There's usually two or three really harsh critics. How can you be so weak? You're a pervert. What's wrong with you? So we get to see if we can soften those managers, getting a relationship with them. And then we were able to find the exile that both the manager and the sexually acting out part we're trying to help. And once we could get to that exile and help the pain of the neglect, and it's funny, I've had many men who didn't have any big physical abuse or sexual abuse, but it was a neglect that really was so hard for them to
Mhm.
deal with.
Mhm.
And I think we're getting to know more and more how what a trauma
Yeah,
neglect does. Yeah.
totally, totally.
And
Mm.
so it creates anxiety, it creates feeling of not being safe, it creates, this PTSD, like any trauma. And the porn, the pictures really would soothe, as he called his exile, Peter Pain.
Mhm.
And so and then it's funny, after I read that chapter, he was very much involved with me writing it, I even let him read it and stuff. And then he goes, I think I'm okay. I think I can use porn once in a while. And he terminated. And then he came back like a year later, and we did even deeper work. There were other
Mm.
exiles,
Mm.
and then he ended up being able to be free
Mhm.
of the compulsion to look at,
Yeah.
yeah. So
So,
that's a
so
pretty good
in,
example.
yeah, absolutely. So if I could just highlight there that once he was, first of all, and in the writing of it, it really came through your genuine respect and compassion for both sides of that polarization.
That's right.
You
One
know,
must have compassion for the part that acts out sexually, right?
right. And that's
Yeah,
such a can be such a barrier for the client themselves, for therapists, for spouses, for, lots
that's
of
right.
people. How could it be that this part that does these terrible things, and it might be, you worked with sexual offenders, it could be things that are even, more harmful, that are
Yes,
harmful to others, so
right,
how can we possibly have compassion, for a part
right.
that does something like that? And what I love about your example is, oh, there is this really vulnerable, young, innocent kid there who is in a desperate state,
That's right. Yeah,
and used what he could find
right.
to
And
try to
right
bring
there.
some
Yeah,
comfort or some equilibrium to himself. Yeah.
that's right. And it's really complicated. In his case, his mother was real sexually repressed, so there's something about that. And his dad had a mailbox. His dad was a mailman. He had a mailbox, which was a made-up address, so his dad could get porn. So, you were talking about legacy burdens, and many people who have sexual compulsivity, I find it is a legacy. It's amazing how many have come from fathers, if it's a man, from a father who also sexually acted out.
Mhm.
So
Right.
that's another important aspect of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then, yeah, even that, like, then that might have been a validated behavior at certain points in time, or
Right.
culturally
Yeah.
reinforced. And in other
Exactly.
cases, maybe not, or
Not a
ambivalently.
fan. Yeah, depends
Yeah.
on the case. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I worked with this guy who all his peers were looking, he's much younger than this case of Herb, and all his peers were looking at magazines when he turned,
Mhm.
and internet porn
Mhm.
when he went into puberty. So
Mhm.
it was
Yeah.
what you did, and you
Mhm.
objectified women, and that's just what
Right.
you do. And
Mhm.
what's wrong with that? And
Right.
then suddenly he's in a marriage and it's not working out. It's
Mhm.
his wife wants to leave him. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I know your case example was some individual work with him, but I wonder if I could ask, imagining that you were working with his partner as well.
Yes, I didn't in his case, but I've done it in other cases. One thing is the partner can become that critical manager. When we talk about the addiction triangle, the critical manager polarized with the acting out. If the spouse, it doesn't necessarily have to be a woman, but whoever it is, the spouse, the partner wants to take on that role of critical manager
Mhm.
and start checking the partner's phone or the internet history. And so trying to help the partner who feels betrayed not take on that role, to have them be curious about this manager that they're developing to feel safe. So trying to help them you know, soften that manager. And then also in a couple situation, the one that sexually acts out tends to have a lot of shame because they've got that critic telling them how perverted and terrible they are. And when they go to shame, we're trying to heal, try the betrayal from the other partner. Um, they go to shame, so the partner can't be heard. The pain that their sexual acting out caused. So a big thing is to help the person who did act out sexually to deal with their shame so they can really repair with their
Mhm.
partner.
Mhm. Yeah. That brings up, I think, such an important aspect of the healing process in IFIO, which is the witnessing and from self energy.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Because
Mhm.
if I shouldn't keep saying that because it's not just men that sexually act out in the world, but if the one who sexually acts out goes to shame, they can't witness their partner's pain of betrayal.
Mhm.
So exactly what we want is for that the person who has sexually acted out to get enough self energy that they can really understand how their behavior impacted their partner.
Hmm. Right.
And that takes a while. That really takes
Yeah.
a while. Yeah,
Yeah. So you're sitting with both people trying to help them unblend
exactly.
so that from each of their authentic self energy, that's where the hope lies, right?
That's where the hope lies.
That there could be something um, that's I want to say a repair, but I
Yeah,
think
repair.
in some other approaches, I think it becomes like sort of grit your teeth and go back, and maybe I can tolerate being with this person,
But not
in
in
the
our,
interest of
yeah,
the family or something like that. But
right.
like a more complete healing, if it's possible, it involves both self-forgiveness and healing of one's own system, and then being able to show up from a place of strength
Yeah, so
in the
that
present moment.
exactly. So you can really listen to what the impact was on your partner
Hmm.
without going into shame. And also then for the partner, for them to be able to hear the exile underneath the acting out behavior,
Hmm.
that can really help them forgive and have more compassion for the one
Hmm.
acting out.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
got it. Got it.
Mhm.
Mm.
So it can be complete. So people can
Right,
recover it.
right.
Yeah.
And then a next step, which I think may or may not be reached for couples, is sexual recovery after some kind of betrayal trauma.
That's right. That's
Is
right.
that
And that's
something
hard
that's
to
in your wheelhouse also with
yeah,
couples?
I mean, have, I think once there's a way to, if the partner who's felt betrayed feels heard and feels like their partner really gets the impact on them, that then they can begin to do the tracking around the sexual aspect of their relationship. And I think when the emotional can be healed, then they can get back on track with their physical sexuality.
Hmm. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And
Hmm.
I find in that phase that, when self energy is available, and not naively so, I always think it's really important to validate the hurt and like, it's not
Exactly.
one and done, to acknowledge that this is, maybe challenging for some of the parts, and making sure something I talk about a lot with people is internal consent. This idea that you're
Right.
doing this, you really have the consent of your system to be approaching some kind of touch and intimacy again. And
That's
one
right.
part isn't steamrolling other parts because you feel like you have to do this.
Because you're afraid
Um,
of losing. Some people are afraid to not have sex with their partner who's betrayed them because they'll betray them again. So you
right.
want to be curious. And I love that internal consent,
Hmm.
enthusiastic consent
Hmm.
all along the way. So
Right.
yeah, that's really good to be aware of. Mm.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's enthusiastic, sometimes it may be willingness to at least give it a try, but that
Yeah,
there's some permission, in there so the person doesn't get a backlash later.
that's right. So making sure that's where the person is before they
Hmm.
start engaging
Right.
again.
And then when there's self energy present, it can open up that courage and curiosity and creativity, because it may be that the sexual connection isn't going to look exactly like it did before.
Right.
Maybe,
And
maybe it'll be better. Maybe it'll be different. Maybe it needs to be much more limited, to gain
right.
the
Just
trust of the of each of their systems.
like take baby steps
Hmm.
before they,
Yeah.
yeah. And also perhaps the one that's been betrayed can be more of the initiator
Hmm. Yeah.
so that they have a little more, they felt powerless, right?
Hmm.
Heretofore.
Yeah.
And not that it's about power exactly, but to not feel powerless and
Hmm.
feel like they have more, I want, there's another word besides power, but
Hmm.
consent,
Hmm.
yeah, courage,
Yeah.
like you say, self energy around their sexuality.
Hmm. Yeah. And something that we I'm not good at remembering all the statistics, but that there's often an assumption in couples therapy that when the emotional repair happens, that the sex will take care of itself.
Yeah, and I don't agree with that either. Do you?
Yeah,
No,
no, I
no.
don't. And as a sex therapist, this is where
Yeah.
I know there's data about that, that often couples really need explicit attention paid, and whether or not they're recovering from a betrayal or something like that, just that repairing emotionally doesn't necessarily translate into sexual connection and,
And vice versa, right? You can
Mhm.
have great sex and not a good
Mhm.
emotional connection. So,
Right.
right. So everybody needs different to look at all of that. But right, there's no guarantee that you
Mhm.
repair this and automatically things are going to be okay in the bedroom. It's
Mhm.
about communicating, right?
Mhm.
And that's where you asked me earlier. I'm coming back around the courageous communication that NIFIO, once they were unblended enough, they could start to talk about this. When you do this, that really works for me in the bedroom, but when you do that, it doesn't, and start really speaking for their parts around the sexual connection.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And gosh, I'm just always so humbled by what a journey that can be, and I think there's levels of privilege that people have when it comes to sexuality. If someone was raised in a fairly healthy, sex positive household, if there was a certain amount of touch and affection and healthy boundaries around that as well, growing
Which is,
up.
yeah, which is probably more unusual than the opposite. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Then continuing to have a positive sexual connection later in life is easier. And even if there's
right.
been some bumps in the road, there's something to come, there's a foundation, And for other people, like you're saying, they maybe have never seen a healthy relationship and or a healthy sexual relationship, or
Mhm.
a respectful sexual relationship, or maybe they've never known people who aren't heavily burdened, in their own sexual systems. So it takes so much courage and persistence to create that, and
It
create a
really does.
healthier
Mhm.
pattern for yourself and for future generations. I've been
Oh,
so moved by the work people do when they're given the opportunity and with such a commitment to wanting to not pass down, these
yeah,
legacy of negativity.
that's a wonderful thing. Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. And just to get people to be able to talk about sex. I was thinking about when I was thinking about doing this podcast, I am really comfortable talking about sex, but I remember going through perimenopause and menopause, and suddenly I needed to use lubricant. And I was embarrassed to tell my husband. And
Mm,
we have a really good relationship in
yeah.
other areas, and we can talk about anything. But
Hmm.
and even I, who feel comfortable,
Hmm.
what I was embarrassed
Hmm.
to tell him that I needed to, interrupt our process. So
Hmm.
I get it. It's really hard to
Yeah,
talk about, to have
absolutely.
the courageous communication about it. Mhm.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that example and how just normal developmental processes over time change what we need sexually, what feels good, what is uncomfortable. All those things
Yeah,
keep changing. So
it
even if
really does.
people start out with a strong sexual connection in their relationship, a lot of things can happen. There can be illness or
Having
post
babies.
childbirth or
Right.
surgeries or medications with side effects. In mental health, a lot
Exactly.
of people take medications that can have sexual side effects. Just
Yeah, I
all these
didn't even
different
know.
things.
Yeah, and aging. Since
Mhm.
I'm old, I'm really aware of that, and how many men start having erect. Maybe they never had erection problems, and suddenly their erection
Mhm.
wanes and
Mhm.
waxes, and they don't like it. And
Yeah,
but it's hard to talk to your partner about it.
absolutely.
Yeah,
I I read Barry. I don't know if you're familiar with Barry
I
McCarthy's
am.
work,
Yeah.
who's an amazing sex therapist and has done lots of research. But he said the majority of non-sexual relationships for older couples um, are the stopping of the sex happens due to the male partner,
Yeah,
and
I
often
understand that.
following just one. or two incidents of not being able to get erect
That's sad.
and
But
without any conversation, kind of a
right.
unilateral withdrawal
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
sexuality.
And I've seen that in my practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just those shame. I had the privilege of having Martha Sweezy on as a guest on the podcast who talking
Oh,
about shame
great.
and guilt through the lens
Mhm.
of IFS, and I'm getting more precise in my talking about it, that the shameful parts, the shamer parts and the shameful parts
Yes. The
that can
part
come
that's,
out around all these different aspects of our sexual functioning.
yeah. So a man might say, I mean, because men are um, raised to, you're supposed to be erect, you're supposed to be aroused.
Mhm.
And then as it goes away, they probably have a critical shame, a shamer in their head. I'm not a
Mhm.
man anymore. I've
Right.
lost my libido, and then feeling shame about it and not being able to talk to their spouse and then their partner and then their partner suffers.
Mhm.
It feels
Yeah.
lonely and rejected. So it gets really complicated.
Yes, it does.
Mhm.
And if people have the fortitude to actually try to get help with that, coming to a sex therapist or to a couples therapist, if they're not able to get through it on their own, that's something that there's so many things that can be helpful with that,
So many things. Yeah,
and it can really give a whole new chapter to a sexual relationship.
that's right. Because as we age, it's more, there's all sorts of ways to be intimate beyond intercourse.
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
So I think throughout the whole lifespan, it's helpful to adopt a broad understanding of what constitutes sex and what
Right.
is what is sex and what is sexual behavior, whether that's solo or partnered. It's more than penetration, penetrative, intercourse. I think, queer folks and kink folks and people in other communities have more of an appreciation of that and tend to
Yeah.
have really many are more often, have evolved language and practices for not just assuming knowing what's going to happen and being able to really
Right.
discuss and negotiate sexual activity. And not to say, no one is necessarily free of challenge in that area, but that often it's the more traditional, cis couple, heterosexual couples, that there's such a script
Right.
for how
It,
sex is supposed to look that are sometimes the most bound up in
yes.
what do we if we can't conform to this, things are really, really broken. And when we
Yeah,
can
things are changing.
redefine sexuality and really broaden it and help people understand, how to have those courageous conversations and communication and
Yeah.
what's possible, they can really see improvements.
Yeah, and even with gay men, for example, or lesbian couples, it gets real complicated as well.
Mhm.
Even though they might be more creative, it doesn't have to be a certain traditional, missionary style intercourse. They've got more
Mhm.
creativity, but they
Mhm.
also have really a lot of complex issues regarding
Mhm.
sexuality, like everybody else does.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, is there anything else you'd want to share with listeners? Any quick tips for unblending? Any little things that you maybe have found helpful to
Yeah,
help
sure.
couples to feel more self-led in bed?
Sure. I want to say just what comes to mind and is if one of the partners is dealing actively in their individual therapy with sexual abuse,
Mhm.
that it might be a time to not pressure to have sex, perhaps.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean you can't, but it just means to be sensitive to our exiles that have been hurt sexually.
Mhm.
They might need attention before, and that those parts of you that have been hurt sexually do not have to be in the bedroom.
Mhm.
They can be somewhere safe. So learning all your sexual hurts, each them doesn't matter what gender, but like you're talking about intersexuality, all the different ways that people have had their physical integrity violated, is important to work with that to free, so there can be more self-energy on board.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then that whole thing we were talking about, consent, um, enthusiastic consent through the
Mhm.
whole process,
Mhm.
and helping couples learn to say no if something doesn't feel right, and to communicate while they're having a sexual encounter.
Mhm.
So learning about sexual hurts, and then being able to communicate about what works and what, and you know the work of Come As You Are, Emily Nagoski, the whole idea of context, when
Mhm.
just being able to navigate when what things help encourage. And also I really like her talking about our emphasis on desire, that we can get to sexual intimacy without having a lot of desire, spontaneous
Mhm.
desire.
Mhm.
That it's about setting up a context that works for both people, and maybe it's a trouble, or how many ever people are going to
Mhm.
have a sexual encounter, that to really communicate what's the context, what works, what doesn't
Mhm.
work,
Mhm.
and just being able to speak for their parts.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
lovely.
and
Thank
it
you.
sounds easy, but it,
Yeah.
it takes a while to have the
Right.
confidence to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there anything you want to share about your current work or what's next for you?
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit slowing down. I'm getting older. Um, but I do have this interest in working keep keep maybe doing workshops for people, for therapists, where they can have some time to really feel into their own parts and explore their sexual hurts, or their parts that are protected against talking about it. What stops you when you're with a couple to talk about it? So I think continue to work with couple therapists. I
Mhm.
also, I feel like in our culture, and I don't want to get political, but I am a little bit. With the Supreme Court decision taking away women's right to choose, with our president, our incoming president, who is grabs pussy, for example, I'm having this desire to work with women, and especially women bodies, but also men, all men, cis and trans. Trans people have a really high incidence of sexual abuse, as you know, I'm sure. And to the sexual hurts, to help people with their
Mhm.
sexual hurts. And I really think this national movement of conservatism, and this push for women to be, especially women, to be second class citizens, and also trans people, and maybe polyamorous people, are going to feel more oppressed. I hope not, but it seems like
Mhm.
they will. And I guess I want to provide some healing. I don't know. I
Mhm.
don't have, I'm just sort of talking so broadly,
Yeah.
but having some
Yeah.
spaces where people can feel free
Mhm.
to talk about um, these sexual hurts, and
Mhm.
how to heal.
Mhm.
I know that's
Yeah.
kind of vague, but
Oh,
that's what my heart.
absolutely. No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's, naming it and talking about it helps those things to manifest.
Right. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I really feel the heart you have, for healing and offering compassionate and safe spaces for
Yeah.
people.
Safe spaces. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I just did that workshop in the Netherlands, and people were thrilled
Mhm.
and then amazed that I can stand in front of a room and talk about sexuality.
Mhm.
I mean, it's just unusual. So
Yeah. Yeah.
bringing more of that to the world.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And if I could ask you, if outside of work and the healing work, even, would you want to share something that you find pleasurable in your life?
Are you talking about in bed?
I'll leave
I
that
don't
up to
want
you. You
to,
can
okay.
check with your parts
I
for
don't want to gross
internal
people
consent.
out. No. Well, I just
Just
find,
life's pleasure. I believe that pleasure in the bedroom is connected to pleasure all around, when we can
yeah,
really be in touch with the things that make us feel good and
that's
that
right.
we
So,
deserve them, that
yeah,
matters.
yeah, that matters to feel like I deserve to have pleasure and to me, it all goes, a lot of it has to do with IFS and mindfulness and, being in the moment. It's all, to me, pleasure in the bedroom or at the beach or even talking to you. It's like just being in the present. And so I do try to meditate and I work with my parts and I'm still in therapy, and just ways that my protectors can relax and let me be here.
Love that. Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Thanks.
Um, cool. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much.
So my pleasure. It's great to
Yeah,
have this conversation with you.
cool. Take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Self Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self energy. Until next time.